introduce the guest speaker for this afternoon. He's a friend of mine. I consider him a friend of mine. He's a colleague of mine and works at CFRA Radio. He's a speaker at large, or commentator at large. He has several degrees in history, two from the University of Toronto, and a PhD in American history from the University of Texas in Austin. I was thinking it was the University of Austin in Texas, which makes sense, but that's not what they call it. He's also an academic. He works in academia. He has done work in think tanks and is politically active as well. And he's also an author. Are you not an author? Or did I get those? No, I know why, because you're an author. Anyway, let me introduce you, please, and please give a warm welcome to John Robson.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the people who got the sound system.
Right here. If it starts to feedback, you are now in your own audio person.
Oh my goodness.
Right there. Okay, you don't want to stand in front of you.
Okay,
Right there.
that's the modern world for you.
Just bring it down.
Including, pardon me, I'm not texting while I speak, I'm setting up the recorder.
And a little closer to the mic, John. Thank you.
We'll get there. And so this setup makes me look even smaller, but it makes me easier to hear, so it's a good trade-off. And, earlier Nick said that there is nothing more powerful than a man with a dream, and I want to put that theory to a severe test here today, because my dream is that we could fix the Canadian Constitution. And this is not for the faint of heart, because previous attempts to fix it have either failed dismally or succeeded dismally, particularly the 1982 Constitution Act, which I think is an extraordinary example of how not to make a constitution from beginning to end. And I was asked by Paul Bunner to write a piece about this for C2C, the Manning Center Journal, and the general feeling was we should not open the Constitution, because every time you start to open that can, it's not worms that come out, it's snakes. Keep it sealed. Nothing is wrong. And my argument was, no, you're meant to fix the roof while the sun is shining. And we have a Constitution that does not work, that is failing in all kinds of ways. It is not giving us good government, it is not uniting us, and it is not a sound structure for stormy weather. So let us not wait until the storm is on us to fix it. And when you look at public policy, you can see all kinds of ways in which our constitutional order is breaking down. And one of the most conspicuous ones, obviously, the lack of protection for property rights. And I could give a whole talk on property rights, the essence of which would be that, although some people sometimes portray property rights as some sinister defense of the rich, the right to own yachts and mansions and be indifferent to the starving poor outside the gates. Property is about ownership of yourself, of your time and your effort, and the dream that you have of what you'd like to do in the time you're given on earth. And that nobody should be allowed to intrude on the way that you think you should live your life, provided you're not yourself committing acts of force or fraud against others. That you can make the home you want for yourself and your family, that you can pursue the career that you think is your calling. And so it's one of the major omissions in the 1982 Constitution Act is property. And at the time of the Charlottetown Accord, polls showed that there was enormously strong support for putting property rights in the Constitution, but that was only on the part of the people. It didn't suit the politicians. And then they committed, of course, a terrible blunder with the Charlottetown Accord. They asked us what we thought. And they got the most enormous thumbs down you could imagine across the board. This wasn't one section of Canadian society ganging up on them. There was enormous opposition from almost everywhere, from Quebec, from British Columbia, from Aboriginals. Everybody was on board. They were just on board the ship that was trying to sink the Charlottetown Accord, and down it went. But when you look at all the things that are wrong in our Constitution, including the inability to change the Senate, the way in which the functioning of Parliament, the idea that MPs are meant to be there to scrutinize budgets and protect us from an arrogant, overreaching executive branch, all of this stuff is breaking down around us. But the more you look at the things that are going wrong and say, we should try and do something about this, the more you run up against the single biggest fault in our Constitution, which is that you can't amend it. I mean, that's not literally true. If you look at our Constitution, it contains an amending formula. Actually, that's rather a polite word for what it contains. And when I lecture on American history, I do a survey course on the United States pre-revolution, and it goes through the Constitution period. And then I show the students the American Constitution amending formula. It is 143 words long. It's all in one clause, and 37 of them are lapsed because they were a lamentable attempt to protect the institution of racial slavery. And fundamentally, it says 2/3 of each house proposes amendments to the Constitution, that is the House of Representatives and the Senate, and then they are sent to the states to be ratified. Basically, the Americans are taking changes in fundamental law back to the people who made their Constitution to see if the people approve. Now, this method is not perfect. Sometimes you get constitutional amendments you shouldn't have, like prohibition, which they in fact reversed. Some people would argue the income tax was in that category. Other times you don't get constitutional amendments you should get. Slavery should, of course, have been abolished immediately, and it was not abolished immediately. It was not abolished for far too long, and then it was not abolished with proper effect. But nevertheless, no human contrivance is perfect. The American Constitution is pretty straightforward, and when it came time to directly elect senators, or so they thought, in 1913, they amended their Constitution. The Congress proposed it, it went to the people and to the states, and they ratified it. A nice, short amendment, Amendment 17, saying you elect senators. Our amending formula, by my attempts to count it, and I'm not promising I got it right, is at least 1,081 words. There are provisions connected with amending our Constitution that run through, again, our Constitution is such a dog's breakfast that I'm not certain I got this right, but there seem to be 13 different parts of our Constitution that talk about the amending formula. And when you look at the amending formula with respect to the Senate, these provisions seem to me to contradict one another. I'm not sure if they do. Lawyers are not sure if they do. Heaven only knows what the Supreme Court would say if asked about on this point, and whether what the Supreme Court said would have anything to do with what the Constitution said is again an open question. And then I show my students the result of this, and it's a picture of Mike Duffy. Something is the matter here. And when I say that, I'm not asserting by any means that we would have agreement in this room about what we should do about the Senate. I'm still angling for an appointment, but I think that my tendency to be harshly critical of the incumbent Prime Minister is obstructing my efforts to land that particular date. So thank you all for contributing to our Kickstarter project, because apparently I'm not headed for the Red Chamber anytime soon. But the fact of the matter is, it doesn't matter what we think about changing the Constitution when it comes to the Senate or anything else, because it can't be done, and if it could be done, we couldn't do it. Because we are just the people. And our Constitution, the 1982 Constitution, is a backroom deal, and one of its most obnoxious features is that amending it is also a backroom deal. If they get together in that infamous kitchen, which is now being reconstructed apparently, they were arguing whether it really happened in the kitchen anyway, but part of our mythology is three guys in a kitchen decided principle wasn't important and cut a deal. Yay, that's Valley Forge for you. But if they all get together, they might create the impression of inevitability. And also that, it's like Jacques Parizeau and his unending visit to the dentist. If they start meddling with it, we'll tell them to go ahead just so they'll stop. But again, this is no way for people to govern themselves. We hear all about Canada is great, Canadians are great people, and then they give us this in consequence. This makes no sense. So Robert Stanfield apparently once said that Canada works until we stop to think about it. There's this bicycle theory of Canada. That's a great argument for not thinking about things, but why should we accept that our country is something that does not bear close examination? I think this is a gravest insult. I think it's an insult to the people who fought for this country in the 2 world wars and in Korea. I think it's an insult to the people who settled the country. I think it's an insult to the people who today continue to generate wealth despite the best effort of their governments to stop them, and to raise families and to make this one of the best countries on earth to live. I think we should be able to think about things, and I think we should be able to think about our Constitution. And when I'm talking about the idea that our Constitution is unworthy of us, I don't mean the whole thing. I think constitutional monarchy is a wonderful system. Coming out of the mists of time, we found a way to restrain our rulers, to create liberty under law, to give people property rights, that much of what is in our Constitution deserves to be preserved, and that includes, in fact, much that is in our Charter of Rights. The Charter of Rights comes in for a lot of criticism, and much of it comes directly from me. But there are things in it that do speak to our heritage. Freedom of conscience and religion, freedom of thought, belief, opinion, and expression, including freedom of the press, peaceful assembly, freedom of association, the right to life, liberty, and security of the person, not to be deprived thereof except in accordance with fundamental justice. This stuff comes out of Magna Carta. And, I'm not going to go on endlessly. I've got Magna Carta on the brain for obvious reasons. But there is also much in the Charter of Rights that is bad. That collective rights, they're ill-defined rights, and also, just going back to the freedom of thought. The United States Constitution says the government may not infringe freedom of thought. The United States Constitution, drawing on the British tradition, there's a rule about no right without a remedy. There's no point telling you have something unless you're given a legal instrument by which you can secure it. The American Constitution protects freedom of speech by saying the government can't take it away. Our Constitution is much more in the French style, promises you something wonderful, but doesn't exactly say how you're going to get it or what it really means. And then you can get into arguments that freedom of speech means the right to an audience, which means they force you to listen, which takes you into Canadian content. I mean, how do you reconcile freedom of the press with the government telling you what you have to put on your news station? And the answer is you do it by blurring the lines. And, again, these are all these kind of things that are wrong with the details of our Constitution. But I'm not suggesting we get rid of the whole thing. I'm suggesting we get back to the way it's meant to work. And we cannot do that by fiddly amendments to a Constitution which can't be amended. And that's why I said what we need to do is redo the Constitution. Take what is good about the British North America Act, which is most of it. Take what is good about the Charter of Rights, which is about half of it. And put these into a document that takes out the things that don't work, and then take it to the people for ratification, with an amending formula that requires amendments to go to the people for ratification. And if I say this, there's liable to be a hand at the back, or if I say it to politicians, a hand at the front saying, oh, that's American. Nothing could be more disgusting than the United States of America. But it's not. It's Canadian, because we are part of the tradition of British liberty that comes out of Magna Carta and that the American founding fathers deliberately copied. If you listen to their rhetoric as they are moving toward an open break with Britain, they are forever claiming the rights and liberties of Englishmen and saying that the British crown has gone wrong. You know what happens sometimes people cross the floor in politics and they say, I didn't leave my party left me. Well, that is the position of the American founding fathers, clearly and expressly. They took Magna Carta over to the New World with them, and they were keeping it, even if something had gone wrong in Britain. And in fact, one of the results of the American Revolution is that people in Britain thought, yes, something has gone wrong in Britain. In 1780s, it's the height of the fighting in the 13 colonies, as they were shortly not to be, a resolution was introduced in the British House of Commons, and it said, be it resolved that the power of the Crown has increased, is increasing, and ought to decrease. And it passed. In the House of Commons that was based on a very unequal, very Tory and Crown-friendly kind of franchise, it passed anyway. And you see that the power of the Crown in Britain diminishes after that. Parliament, the branch of the government elected by the people, becomes dominant. And when we get the British North America Act, we get a constitution similar in principle to that of the United Kingdom, which is a kind of funny thing to say, because if you read the British North America Act, you notice two things that are very unlike the Constitution then prevalent in the United Kingdom. First of all, you're reading it. There's no written constitution in Britain. Secondly, it's federal, and the United Kingdom is not federal. But the people who made Canada, the British North America Act, were not fools. They meant something much deeper than that. What they meant is that this is a country of liberty under law where the government may not take away the rights of the citizens. And the British system in the 19th century functioned very much in that way. I mean, don't forget, it was in Britain, and it was a court ruling that the free air of Britain's incompatible with slavery. Another court ruling said our law knows nothing of state necessity. There is no act which is lawful because the government thinks it is urgent that would otherwise be unlawful. And another principle, the Crown can do no wrong. And this one could easily be misunderstood. If you live in a tyrannical government and you hear that this rule that the Crown can do no wrong, you think any order that comes from the top must be obeyed and may be carried out with impunity. But in the British system and then in the Canadian system, it means the exact opposite. It means that the government is quite literally legally incapable of giving an unlawful order. And anyone who carries out an instruction from the monarch or anyone else, and that if it is contrary to the law, they are fully liable for the unlawfulness of that event. It's all liberty under law. And that is the system that we had until very recently, but one that I think a lot of us see breaking down with regulatory agencies that are not subject to scrutiny or accountability, with human rights commissions that do not follow due process, with a parliament that can no longer scrutinize legislation, budgetary or otherwise, because there's too much of it. The bills are too long, the spending programs are too big. But in order to understand